everyone, and I hope your Purim went nicely. And now we're approaching, of course, the holiday of Pesach. And I wanted to share with you a thought about a commandment that is very, very significant at the Seder, although it's of rabbinic origin. We know that in addition to the Haggadah, we have an obligation to drink 4 cups of wine during the Seder, and we do so at different juncture points. After Kiddush, we drink wine. And then after we finish the narrative of the Magid, we drink a wine. Then after we say Birkat Hamazon, the grace after meals, we drink wine. And then the 4th cup of wine is after the recitation of Hallel. This is called the mitzvah D'Rabbanan of Dalid Kosos, of drinking 4 cups of wine. And this is based, however, on a biblical pasuk that when the Torah describes God's promise to liberate us from Mitzrayim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu uses 4 lishonos of geula, 4 terms of redemption. V'otseisi, I will take you out. V'itzalti, I will save you. V'ga'alti, I will redeem you. V'lokachti, and I will take you unto me for a nation. And keneged, the 4 lishonot of geula, the Chachamim made a takana, made a rule that we drink 4 cups of wine to experience our gratitude for that redemption. Now, the question is very obvious. Yetziat Mitzrayim, the exodus of Egypt, was a single event. God took us out of Egypt. Why do we utilize 4 terms of redemption to describe the unitary action of Yetziat Mitzrayim? So I'm going to give you 2 answers. One is a shorter answer and one is a longer answer. The shorter answer is given by the Netziv, the great Rosh Yeshiva of Volozhin, in his commentary Hamik Davor, in which he says that in fact Yetzias Mitzrayim did occur in stages. Although the holiday date that we commemorate is the 15th of Nisan, there were stages that occurred throughout the 10 plagues in which the slavery got progressively relaxed. The first redemption occurred when we were no longer avodat perech. Avodat perech is backbreaking work. At some point in the Makos, the Netziv shows, Paro took away the torture and the backbreaking labor. So that was redemption number 1, although we were still slaves. Later, during the 10 plagues, he even took away the slavery. Then the 3rd stage was we actually left Mitzrayim. That occurred on Pesach. And the 4th stage is spiritual liberation, when God took us unto him for a nation, which is Matan Torah. So as a result, we have 4 lishonot of geula, because this corresponds to the 4 liberations. Liberation from backbreaking labor, number 1. Liberation from slavery, number 2. Physically exiting Egypt, number 3. Receiving God's Torah and being spiritually liberated, number 4. And hence the 4 lishonot of geula are matim, they do correspond to Yetziat Mitzrayim. That is the Netziv's answer. And indeed, it's very telling. We don't have time to go into it. He actually shows you in the language of the verses themselves that during the 10 plagues, 2 of these stages occurred. The backbreaking labor was relieved, and the status of slaves was eventually removed, and that occurred during the Makos themselves. Rav Meir Simcha, the Meshech Chachma, the author of Ohr Somayach, the namesake of our yeshiva, gives a bit of a longer answer. The Meshech Chachma explains that although slavery is a single event, there were 4 distinct dangers that the Jewish people faced from which they needed divine redemption. A slave faces what we might call 4 risks to their ultimate survival and redemption. Number 1 is a risk to their physical safety. A slave can often be killed, can often die of starvation, die of disease, be killed by their master. So threat number 1 to a slave is a threat to their very physical existence. That is problem number 1. Problem number 2 is a loss of one's spiritual values. When you live in a debased society, a corrupt and immoral society, you can lose your spiritual bearing and you can suffer what we might call spiritual assimilation. Now, granted, as a slave, you will not be invited to assimilate in general society. But in terms of your values, your mores, your spiritual bearings, eventually you become coarsened, you become cheapened, you become degenerate, and you lose the very sense of goodness and morality that you might have had before. So threat number one is to my physical survival. Threat number two is to my spiritual destiny. Now, threat number three is kind of related to number two, but it's a little different. And that is, a slave has no sense of history. You know, even if you've studied, for example, the African slavery in the United States before the Civil War, slaves were often ripped, or blacks in Africa were often ripped from their families. They had no sense of who their father was, who their mother was. They had no sense of a yichus, of a lineage that gave them pride. Many of the ancestors of slaves, we know from the book Roots, were in fact royalty. Some of them were kings and queens and nobility. But when you're a slave, you have no sense of where you're coming from. And the saying has been said many times, if you don't know where you're coming from, you don't know where you should be going to. You can have no sense of my future if I don't have a connection to my past. So danger number two is being uprooted from your past. And danger number three is a lack of hope that the future can ever be better. At some point, a person just gives up hope. They feel that freedom is impossible, redemption is impossible. Things are never going to get better. And when there's a lack of hope, that can actually be fatal. Even in medical literature, we've discovered it's kind of a reverse placebo effect. That when a person determines they have no chance of survival, even if that's unfounded, their body begins to shut down in various ways that may be irreversible. Hope is essential for life. When there's no hope, you're gone. So the Meshech Chochmah concludes that the reason why we have 4 Lashonot of Geula is because God rescued us from 4 dangers. We face danger to our physical life, danger to our spiritual life, danger to our loss of a sense of history, and danger to our sense of hope that things could ever be better. Hence, Daled Lashonot of Geula keneged these 4 dangers. But then the Meshech Chochmah goes further. In order to be redeemed from dangers, in order for God to give us the gift of redemption, there must be behaviors on our part that counteract those dangers. There must be, in the language of Kabbalah, isaruta delatata. There must be some awakening from below in order to elicit isarusa deliela, the awakening from above. So what were the 4 behaviors mitzidenu from our perspective that address these 4 dangers? So here the Meshech Chochmah relies on a text that is in the Mechilta. The Mechilta is the Medrash, halachic Medrash on Shemos. And some of you might have heard different lists, but we're working with the Mechilta's list. That even though the Jewish people were idol worshippers, and even though they didn't practice circumcision, and they were on the 49th level of impurity, there were 4 fundamental zechuyot, 4 merits that protected them from hitting level number 50. Zechut number 1 is they did not intermarry. They remained faithful to their wives. Zechut number 2, they did not speak Lashon Hara against each other. Now, that doesn't mean they were from and they were reading the Chafetz Chaim. But what it means is they didn't turn against each other to get advantages. We know that even in the Holocaust, superimposed on the tragedy of the Holocaust was the occasional sad reality that there were some Jews who would occasionally become informers to get food for their families or whatever. In Mitzrayim, the Yidden had a united front. They did not turn against each other in order to get advantages. So one zechus is no intermarriage. The other zechus is they didn't speak Lashon Hara, which is really unity, a united front against the oppressor. The third is they didn't change their names, they kept their Jewish names. And number 4, they continued to speak the holy language. They continued to speak Hebrew. These are 4 zechuyot that preserved our forefathers in Mitzrayim. What the Meshech Chochmah wants to do is, he wants to take these 4 merits and match them up to the 4 dangers. Each one of these merits is a behavior that will protect us from one of the dangers. And that created the Isarusa Delatata, the awakening from below, that elicited the awakening from above. Not intermarrying, just to take the order of the Mechilta. That is the antidote against spiritual assimilation. When you live in a society whose morals and values are decadent and totally against your spiritual heritage, and as a slave, you are exposed to that day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, what is the bulwark that allows you to keep the spiritual significance of a Tselem Elokim, one who is made in the image of God? And that is the marital bonds between husband and wife. Remember that marriage in Judaism is called kiddushin, sanctification, holiness. It's a cliche, but halachically it's true that the most important institution in Judaism is not the synagogue, not the yeshiva, and not even the Beis HaMikdash. The most important institution in Judaism is the sacred Jewish home, the relationship of husband and wife, parent and child. That is why halachically the very first institution that a Jewish community must create is a mikvah that allows husbands and wives to have intimacy. So as a result, if we face the sakana of spiritual assimilation, it was the not intermarrying, the maintenance of a Jewish home, the kedusha of a home and husband and wife that saved us. Now, it didn't save us totally. We were on the 49th level of impurity. We were pretty bad. But what prevented us from hitting level number 50 was the holiness in the relationship of husband and wife. So that corresponds, that zechut corresponds to the spiritual assimilation. Now, the second one was unity in the face of adversity, not giving in to the oppressor, not turning against each other for the advantages we might have gotten in terms of food or money or shelter or better living conditions or the like. That is the great protection for our physical survival. You know, it is said at the time of the American Revolution, I believe it was either Thomas Paine or Benjamin Franklin, who said, we must all hang together, because if we don't hang together, we will hang separately. And I'm very happy to borrow that motto from the non-Jewish world and apply it to Klal Yisrael as well. When the Jewish people are united, God protects us physically. Our lives are protected. When we live in a state of disunity and machlokas, we are vulnerable to all of the enemies out there. And therefore, if the faithfulness of husband and wife was the bulwark against spiritual assimilation, it is the unity and the Avat Yisrael that is the protection against physical dangers to our lives. United, we will survive. Divided, we are vulnerable and we are weak. Now, the third danger was we had no sense of history. So the Meshech Chochmah says, Mitzidenu, from our perspective, the zechut that addressed that problem was we kept our names. Because generally speaking, a Jewish name is a link to your past. If you're named an Avram, a Yitzchok, a Yaakov, you're either going back to the Avos, Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, or Sarah, Rivka, Leah, or even if it's Aunt Rachel, or Bubby, Esther. It reminds a child that you didn't come from nowhere. You have a family, you have a history. You have ancestors who were holy and were good. and you connect to them and you link to them. You know, even the affectionate names in Yiddish, Bobala, Mamala, Tatala, Zedala, all of these, little mommy, little daddy, little grandmother, little grandfather. When you name a child after a parent or after a grandparent, so you call them that to express reverence. You don't even refer to your grandfather by name, even if it's your son that has that name. What does that tell a child? You're part of a community. You're part of a cloud. You have a history. You don't come from nothing. And if you know where you come from, as I said before, you know where you have to go. So you see what the Meshech Chochmah is saying. The faithfulness of husband and wife protects us against spiritual assimilation. The unity in not speaking Lashon Hara and not seeking advantages from the enemy protects us from physical annihilation. Keeping our Jewish name, our Yiddish name, connects us to our past. And then the final danger that we faced was a loss of hope. The slavery goes on and on and on, seemingly without limit. And at some point you just give up. What did we do to preserve hope? We kept our language. You know that Latin, at one point in history, was the most widely spoken language in the world. It was the language of the Roman Empire, which conquered most of the known world at the time. And yet, Latin today, few people still speak it, but it's certainly not a major language. And even in the Roman Catholic Church, that was the last holdout. B'derech klal, they no longer require that their prayers, their masses, be recited in Latin. Latin is pretty much of a dead language. And the reason is that since the Roman Empire is not coming back, there was no reason to actively pursue its language. So now let's talk about Hebrew here. If I am a Jew languishing in Mitzrayim, and I truly believe that this is it, there's never going to be a redemption, there's never going to be a geula, we're never going to go back to our land, why am I keeping the Hebrew language? Why am I teaching my son language? So look at what the message is. When I teach my son Lashon HaKodesh, I am communicating to my child. Yes, right now we're slaves in Egypt, but there will come a time, maybe it'll be in my life, maybe it'll be in your life, and maybe it'll be in the lives of your children or your grandchildren after we're long gone. But there will be a time that we will be coming back to our land. We will be coming back to Eretz Yisrael, and we will speak our language once again. So very beautifully, the Meshech Chochmah identifies 4 dangers for which there are 4 lashonot of geula. He corresponds the 4 dangers to 4 zechuyot, 4 merits, mitzidenu from our perspective, because the underlying message is, in order for us to elicit the redemption of God, we have to step forward and engage in a hishtadlut, in some type of effort from our perspective that addresses those dangers. 4 lashonos of geula, 4 sakanot, 4 responses. So now, consistent with the pattern of 4, let me give you a 4th set of correlations to all of this. And that is the positioning of the 4 cups of wine at various parts of the Seder. The first cup of wine is the cup of Kiddush. What does Kiddush mean? Sanctification, holiness. Kiddush talks about the unique sanctification that God gave to Am Yisrael. And Kiddush is the same word, more or less, as Kiddushin. So as a result, the kos of Kiddush is a celebration of the holiness of the Jewish home, the holiness of husband and wife, which addresses the first danger of spiritual assimilation. Again, the order may be a little different as we go through this. The second cup is drunk at the conclusion of Magid. The Magid portion of the Haggadah is about our history. It reminds us where we came from. So this corresponds to the danger that a slave forgets their sense of history, and we try to recapture it by our Jewish names. And Magid is a celebration of our history. We come from Avram, Yitzchok, and Yaakov, and God made a covenant with Avram, Yitzchok, and Yaakov. And we have to remember that. So again, this is a different order, but the order is not that significant. So the first kos celebrates the redemption from spiritual assimilation. The second kos on Magid celebrates the recapture of our history. So we remember the glorious forefathers of our past and God's love for our forefathers. The third cup is drunk at the conclusion of Birkat Hamazon, benching. Now this is a bit more subtle, but the association is still here. The essence of Birkat Hamazon is Hakaras Hatov, gratitude to God for giving us food and sustenance. We know that when you have gratitude, that takes away jealousy. Pirkei Avos tells us, Eizeu Asher, who is a wealthy person? Hasomayach Bechelko, one who rejoices in his lot. Birkat Hamazon is Hakaras Hatov. Hakaras Hatov equals Somayach Bechelko. When there's Somayach Bechelko, there's no jealousy, there's no rivalry, there's no animosity, and you can then have a society of Avas Yisrael and Achdus. And that addresses the danger of our physical annihilation. Avas Yisrael Achdus. And therefore, Birkat Hamazon corresponds to not speaking Lashon Hara, Someach Bechelko, Avas Yisrael, sense of community that you get when you have gratitude. We finally come to Hallel. Now, one of the interesting halachic anomalies of Hallel is that the Hallel of the Seder night is split into two unequal portions. The first portion of Hallel is recited before the meal as part of the Magid, second cup, but the rest of Hallel is recited after the meal. And the Meforshim explain that is because that each half of Hallel has a different function. The first part of Hallel is thanking God for the Exodus. And that's why it's connected to Magid, which is the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim. But the Hallel after the meal is no longer talking about the Exodus. It is the Hallel looking forward to Mashiach and the ultimate redemption. That is why we pour the cup of Elijah the prophet, who will be the announcer of Mashiach. So it turns out that the fourth cup is the cup of hope, the cup of belief in the future redemption. And that addresses the hope that we had in Mitzrayim, which was exemplified by speaking Lashon HaKodesh. So this is a beautiful, intricate pattern of associations. 4 terms of redemption, 4 dangers, 4 zechuyot, and 4 places where you commemorate these aspects in the course of the Seder, albeit the order is sometimes going to be a little different as you follow it. I hope that this makes the ritual of the 4 cups a bit more meaningful to you all. And if you think about this, we sometimes look at the Jews in Egypt and we say, oh, they were so bad, If you think about these 4 dangers, think about how they apply to us in comfortable Western societies like the United States. Danger to our lives? Baruch Hashem, it hasn't been that bad, but to this day, lives of Jews are in jeopardy in various parts of the world, and in some places even in the United States. Spiritual assimilation? What do you say for a society in which, in some places, the intermarriage rate is 70%? 7 out of 10 marriages involving a Jew will have the other partner a non-Jew. Lack of history. How many Jews know about the Vilna Gaon, about the Chavetz Chaim, about their own Babis and Zaydis and great-great-grandparents? The Holocaust in many ways destroyed our shared history. And so many Jews don't even realize the greatness and the holiness and the nobility from which they came. And lack of hope? Well, lack of hope can sometimes be because you're depressed, but it can also be because you don't think there's any point to the future. There are Jews who basically say, why should there even be a Jewish people? Maybe it's time to just become like the Goyim. So, spiritual assimilation, physical danger, lack of history, lack of hope are not simply what our forefathers faced in Mitzrayim. They are challenges that we face even today. May God give us the strength, the insight, the commitment, the joy, and the enthusiasm to address these dangers both within our own personalities and within the broader Jewish world. And may this Pesach be the springboard to a Geula Shlema B'mheira V'yameinu. Thank you.
Hi, this is Peretz Baruch Eichler, a proud alumnus of Ohr Somayach. Now, what you just watched is one of the many programs that Ohr Somayach provides, leaving its impact on hundreds of thousands, with so many more waiting to be reached. Ohr Somayach's central campus in Jerusalem has over 300 students presently learning there. And now you can be a vital part of spreading that bounty of knowledge worldwide by logging on to donate.ohr.edu. We can step up to the plate at this pivotal moment of Ohr Somayach's growth and bring the next generation of Jews home.